Professor Josh Ober is the Konstantin Mitsotakis Chair in the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. Although his primary appointment at Stanford is in political science, he holds secondary appointment in classics and courtesy appointments in philosophy at the Hoover Institution. His research specializes in the areas of ancient and modern political theory and historical institutionalism. In addition to around 100 scholarly articles, he's the author of a number of books, including The Greeks and the Rational, The Discovery of Practical Reason, published in 2022, and Demopolis, Democracy Before Liberalism in Theory and Practice, published in 2017. His lecture today will focus on his most recent book, which he co-authored with Brook Manville, entitled The Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives.
Well, it's just really a joy to be here, to be a guest of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. I had a wonderful group of Tocqueville scholars this morning, and then got to talk with people in the political science department in mid-morning, and now it's a great joy to be able to talk about the book that Brook Manville and I wrote together. There it goes. Okay, so there is the problem. Democracy here at home and elsewhere in the world is not doing as well as one might hope. And among the underlying problems which have challenged democracy is political polarization. It's not the only problem, but I think it's one of the fundamental issues. Political polarization is a problem in turn because it can lead to, in the most extreme form, what we're calling a Schmittian moment. That is, politics understood in Carl Schmitt's conception of political theology and the friend-enemy relation. Just always like to try this. Carl Schmitt familiar to people? Okay, some, but certainly not everybody. He should be, because I think he is, well, as we'll see, quite influential. Schmitt was a member of the Nazi Party at the time in which it was most relevant, was one of the leading theorists of that era, sometimes called Hitler's jurist. Schmitt is famous for his conceptions of political theology and friend-enemy relation. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. John McCormack, the University of Chicago, wrote an article in 1998, followed it up with a book, but you'll see the reason to start with the article, in which he wrote, quote, "Sage of the left and right in post-war Europe, Carl Schmitt is fast becoming recognized as the 20th century's foremost critic of liberalism." Now, political science is a field, I can tell you, that is better at explanation than prediction. And political theory is not a field that really ever engages in prediction. And yet this almost seems predictive, right? Fast becoming. So we can test McCormack's theory. Those of you who have used Google Ngrams, people know about Google Ngrams? Really a wonderful, very simple tool. Just call it up by Googling Ngrams. Basically, it allows you to simply get a simple count of the number of times a particular term or name is used in basically all of English language literature back into the 19th century and up to not quite the present, about 2020 is as far as they go. So this is an n-grams, as it were, chart that takes us from the 1970s up forward. You can see 1998, the year that the article was written. Indeed, Schmidt and political theology were trending terms, and McCormick was right. Fast becoming, and in fact continues to be really very influential. So the friend and enemy relationship sees politics as existential conflict between hostile factions. That's the sort of core of what Schmidt says, is that you have to understand who the enemy is, who your friends are, and act accordingly. Political theology basically says politics is simply about good versus evil. Good people are my friends, the evil people are my enemies. It demands, implicitly anyway, perfection rather than any kind of a common good that could be agreed upon by people who have in any sense, meaningfully different understandings of the good. And it turns politics into very high stakes contests. So if the winners are going to be my friends or the winners are going to be my enemies, this really pushes up the stakes of politics. And ultimately, friends, enemies sees politics as a zero-sum game, right? There are winners and there are losers. Everything that you gain, I lose, and vice versa. So just a few quotes from Schmidt on this friend-enemy distinction. The specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. So it's basic. Political thought and political instinct prove themselves theoretically and practically in the ability to distinguish friend from enemy. The high points of politics are simultaneously the moments in which the enemy is, in concrete clarity, recognized as the enemy. The friends, enemies, and combat concepts receive their real meaning precisely because they refer to the possibility of physical killing. War follows from enmity. War is the existential negation of the enemy. And I just want to underline that Schmidt is popular not just on one side of the political spectrum, but has been taken up by at least various people on what we might say is pretty far right, but also by theorists on the pretty far left. So this is a shared fascination with this kind of way of thinking about things. Well, where are we, or where have we become? Where are we headed? So the enemy is in concrete clarity recognized as the enemy. And I'm going to give you some quotes that are really from both sides of the American political divide. Trump calling political enemies vermin. And in the recent election, Kamala Harris says Trump is a fascist. And other quotes that you can read more quickly than I can read out for you. The point is, I think, that this friend-enemy relation, recognizing the enemy, has become at least part of what politics, at least in part, is about. Once again, my worry here is polarization. The possibility of physical killing, once again, it is, I think, before us, or has been quite recently. Existential negation of the enemy, once again on both sides. The whole move to abolish, not reduce, not rethink, but abolish, taking the language of abolition from obviously the Civil War period and making it into a slogan for contemporary action. War follows from enmity, and I think, once again, we don't have to belabor this. Here, a slogan on the left, no justice, no peace, ultimately is the kind of statement that says we have to have the possibility of, well, war. Non-negotiable demands for perfection, once again, on both sides, demanding that there should be zero tolerance for those with whom you fundamentally disagree. Raising the stakes of politics, destroyer of democracy, the end of democracy, once again, the idea that politics is really about the existential survival or destruction of, well, maybe an entire way of life. Zero-sum thinking. Here's Donald Trump's biographer. As he explained to me, he's not interested in win-win deals, only in I-win outcomes. And when I asked if he ever left anything on the table as a sign of goodwill so we might do business with the same party in the future, he said no and pointed out that there are many people in the world he can work with one at a time. Well, think tariffs at the moment. So the politics of zero-sum thinking, talking about, sorry, am I getting a reverberation here? Is it okay? Okay. I'm talking about war being waged by some of the wealthiest and most powerful people against working families. So the language of war. Mexican immigrants are taking our jobs, taking our manufacturing jobs. They're killing us. So this language of enemies, of war, of killing. And all of this, I think, helps to explain how democracies die in the title of a very prominent, relatively recent book. Our question in the Civic Bargain is how democracy survives, when it does, for extended periods of time. So the core argument is that long-lasting democracies, democracies that were successful over time, are predicated explicitly not on the friend-enemy distinction. They're not predicated on zero-sum contests between hostile factions, but rather they're predicated on bargaining. So those of you who have done sort of basic game theory or bargaining theory will recognize the solution to John Nash's bargaining problem here. And it's a useful illustration. I mean, there's a lot of complicated math behind it, but it's very straightforward when you think about it. So if you have two sides that are negotiating on the vertical axis and on the horizontal axis, we can start at point P, where the two dotted lines meet, and that's their current share. Right? The idea that we're having share of some good that's being divided. So you can see the elite share in this case is a little more than the mass share. Point P is the current situation. The question then is, can we get to a higher payoff for both sides? And ultimately, sure, it is possible to do so. The curved line is basically the Pareto optimum, where all of the goods that can be distributed are being distributed. And the point Q there on the is where on that line, where on the curved line, we could ultimately hope to get. How do we decide on point Q? Well, that's basically the diagonal, which just simply determines bargaining strength. So in this case, not only does the elite group have a better starting position, but they have greater bargaining strength. Point Q is above the 45-degree horizontal line, which would be an even division. But as you can see, if you imagine just dropping the two lines vertically and horizontally from point Q, both the elite and the mass in this story have done better than they are at point P. And they've done as well as they can because they're at the Pareto frontier. Okay, so this is the idea of bargaining. This is what we should be aiming for, right? That's the point. This is not zero sum. Although one side has done better than the other, it's not, as it were, perfectly equitable. One side started out better and actually had a better, stronger bargaining position, but both sides are better off than they were outside of the bargain. So that's politics. At least that's the kind of politics we're interested in. So we have 4 historical case studies: ancient Athens, Republican Rome, Britain, and the US. Now, these are very different. Both Brook, Manville, and I were trained as historians originally, and so therefore we know that anytime you're going to talk about historical development, you really need to get into the weeds of the details. We're trying to deal with what I think is as it were, 30,000 feet generalities. So yes, you can raise objections to any particular generalizing argument, but we think if you look at these case studies, our argument holds up. So here's the pattern that we think, the general pattern that holds across these case studies. Political bargains is where we start, struck between elites, among elite groups, the king and the nobility, the clergy, and so on. And why? In order to regulate intra-elite, or inter-elite rather, competition, so as to have more rents for everybody. Construct the bargain not to gain justice for all, but rather to regulate conflict. But this can then lead to political concessions to non-elites, because eventually the king realizes that, oh, I can bring the towns in, the commoners in the towns, and that'll give me a stronger bargaining position against the nobles. Great. So you begin to bring in non-elites. This can lead to non-elites becoming bargaining agents. Now that people in the towns can say, well, yeah, we really don't want the taxes to be quite that high. Thank you very much. And ultimately, we the people, some large, reasonably diverse, self-authorized body, may declare ourselves to be citizens. That is, we reject rule by a boss or a gang of bosses. And at that point, we may choose to codify our agreement that allows us to act together, either formally or informally through a document like the American Constitution or through some kind of a civic ritual. And that is what we call the civic bargain. The civic bargain is when, as it were, we the people establish our own rules for organizing the civic space. So run through what I hope will be a relatively familiar, certainly to many of you, story. This is, go back to September of 1787. The Constitutional Convention is just finished. And here in an often told tale, which may be apocryphal, but it's okay. Mrs. Elizabeth Powell, sometimes just called a society matron. That's not at all fair. She was actually a serious intellectual who had a salon, which a lot of the leading people of Philadelphia attended. Anyway, Mrs. Powell supposedly asked Benjamin Franklin, well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy, at the end of the debates that lead to the Constitution. So would it be self-government by citizens, or would Americans be ruled by a king or a tyrant or a dictator? So it would be government by a boss. And Franklin, of course, says to Mrs. Powell, a republic if you can keep it, which is, I think, both a promise, it will be a republic if you can keep it, but it's also a warning, if you cannot keep it, if you do not do what is necessary, then it'll be the other thing. It'll be a monarchy of some sort. Slightly less famous story. This is Franklin's last speech at the convention. So this is before he comes out of it, talks with Mrs. Powell. He actually didn't deliver this speech himself. He was too weak. James Wilson, his fellow Pennsylvania delegate, delivered it for him, but it's Franklin's words. And he agreed to this Constitution, he said, with all its faults, if such they are, noting that there are several parts which I do not at present approve. And yet I consent because I am not sure that this Constitution is not the best. The opinions I have had of its errors, I sacrifice to the public good. Okay, so think about that all for just a moment. Franklin's point, I take it, is that the Constitution is not perfect. It's not perfect by his standards, and indeed by extrapolation, it's not perfect by the standards of any of the other delegates. Instead, it's a bargain, right? The best available bargain, right? I'm not sure that isn't the best. A civic bargain, okay? A bargain among citizens to establish through a, as it were, contract of sorts, how they would live together as citizens. And that's really at the core of what we're talking about. So the Constitution, if we sort of back up and think of the document that they do present, is certainly, in the first instance, to ensure that there is no overall boss, right? The whole idea was to not have a king, a monarchy, and in order to ensure this, you have to limit the scope of the president's authority, balance of powers, Bill of Rights, also limit the authority of the courts and the legislature. So there is no overall boss institution that is going to tell everybody what to do. Second, the Constitution has to provide for security and welfare for the new nation. And this means necessarily strengthening the financial and military authority of the federal government. So the Articles of Confederation had famously failed in this. You've got to answer that. Then it's important to define who is a citizen and what that meant in terms of rights and duties. There's no formal definition of citizen in the Constitution. That's left to the states. But it will be the states will have to, through the sort of most democratic form of voting possible, ratify this new thing. The delegates have to establish the procedural rules, the basic institutions of government. That's what we think of the Constitution as being, right? But it really is sort of in the middle of the basic conditions that make all of this possible. How are they able to establish these procedural rules when none of them thought they were perfect, right? Everybody said had doubts or reservations. Well, they negotiated, and they did so arguably in good faith, and they could do that because they treated each other as civic friends, in Aristotle's term, rather than as Schmittian enemies, despite all of their differences of opinion about all kinds of deep and fundamental matters, most prominently slavery. And that treating each other as civic friends was in turn possible because they'd been educated in the essentials of civic life. Educated by formal learning, the average level of basic background knowledge of political philosophy and history among the delegates was startlingly high, but also by experience. They had all had experience in various of the legislatures, the colonial legislatures. And they were educated by one another. You look at these speeches that are given, and it's long and detailed speeches, but people were actually listening to these things. I mean, they were learning at least what are the fundamental interests of the other delegates. So there's this process of civic education that had been going on for a long time. And I think arguably it is that education that allowed them then to treat each other as civic friends, to give arguments and take arguments and ultimately negotiate in good faith. So this boils down to 7 conditions, which we say are necessary conditions for democracy: no boss except one another, citizens, security and welfare, a defined citizenship, citizen-led institutions, good faith negotiation, civic friendship, and civic education. Right, so it sort of goes from the top down, but you can also build it up from the bottom up. If you don't have civic education, it's hard to have civic friendship of the right level. Without civic friendship, it's hard to negotiate, and all the way up you go. Okay? So we have 4 historical cases: Athens, Rome, Britain, and the US. What we argue for, sort of at a relatively high level, is that getting and keeping security and welfare does not require a boss. Those of you who know Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes, will say, hold it, didn't Hobbes tell us it does require a boss? One guy, a gang, or a majoritarian tyranny, take your pick. Prefer having one guy, we'll say Hobbes is wrong. And how do we show he's wrong? Once again, historical cases. Athens, Rome, the US developed into what Hobbes wanted: wealthy, powerful, relatively secure societies without turning over authority to an all-powerful ruler. Britain's parliament and the rule of law incrementally constrain the power of the monarch in ways that would have Hobbes turning over in his grave. So once again, good theory, but doesn't pay out historically. So one of the value of doing historical cases. Republic and democracy are compatible, with apologies to James Madison, who said they were not. Athens, which is the model ancient democracy, and Rome, the model ancient republic, both combine direct voting on policy and in citizen assemblies with representative councils, and both develop over time detailed legal systems which constrain popular decision-making. We actually know a lot more about ancient democracy than Madison does, because we have more documents than he had available to him. So we're able to say, actually, this distinction is not a hard and fast one, and oughtn't to be holding us up. So we argue that organized political parties are not essential features of democratic republics, at least historically. Modern democracies, yes, but formal political parties were unknown in Athens and Rome. And the US Constitution never mentions political parties. Political parties emerge in the US after the ratification of the Constitution, pretty quickly thereafter, but they're not at least envisioned within the Constitution. So we argue that democracy does require a respect for fundamental rights, including the freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And yet we emphasize that every right also comes with duties or responsibilities on the part of the citizens, who themselves are going to have to be ultimately the ones who defend those rights, not turning it over to a boss, a king, to be the defender of the rights. We have to do it ourselves, or at least we have to appoint representatives who will do it in our name. And defending rights is costly. It's costly in terms of time, energy, resources. And this means that new rights must not be created just casually. You have to think about when new rights emerge, because multiplying rights can ultimately degrade the defense of rights necessary for democracy. You just get crowding out. If there are too many things that impose upon you more or less stringent duties, eventually you may get to the point where you just say, I can't do it. I'm not going to fulfill all these duties. It's not possible. And so at that point, you may end up not defending the fundamental rights that at least we would suggest are essential for sustaining democracy. So this is not against rights, but it's being careful about the multiplication of rights. So civic bargain among citizens is always preceded by political bargains between elites and non-elites. So it's important to see that as a step along the way. In Athens, Solon negotiated a bargain between the rich landholders, the people who were really the powerful, the elite, and the poorest citizens who were falling into debt slavery. This doesn't bring about democracy, but it paves the way for democracy. In Rome, the struggle of the orders, a famous series of bargains between elite patricians, the people who are running everything in early Rome, and the non-elite plebeians. Once again, these bargains were often struck under really harsh conditions. The enemy is marching towards us. The plebeians say, I think we're not going to get involved. Let the enemy take over Rome. What do we care? You elite patricians run everything. The Gauls run everything. What do we care? Of course, then the patricians say, no, come on. You guys got to fight on let's cut a deal. How would you like to be cut into the consulship, and so on. Okay, so these are, once again, bargains. In Britain, Magna Carta, one of many bargains that are made between a monarch, the barons, the church leaders, and various townsmen. So a whole series of things that are built into British history. So the sixth thing that we argue is that increasing scale is both the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge that is faced by a democracy. So scale can be thought of as there are more of us, so the growth in population on the left side, or it can be thought of, it can be thought of in terms of increased diversity. We have people who have very different experiences, different ways of life, whether it's because of racial difference, religious difference, whatever it may be. But greater diversity and greater scale offer an opportunity in the first instance because citizens who have different experiences, different skill sets, can bring that experience and skill set to the basically solution space, trying to solve some problem, and therefore ultimately can increase security and welfare in the face of potential hostile rivals, right? So whether you think diversity is a good thing just generally, it can actually be instrumentally valuable for the basic condition of security and welfare if it's balanced right. Of course, it's also a challenge because more citizens with diverse interests, diverse preferences for different kinds of outcomes in terms of policy can make good faith bargaining and civic friendship more difficult. When people are more different from me, when their interests are more different, when they seem more different, it may be harder for me to accept that they ought to get some of what they want in terms of cutting one of these positive sum deals. It may be easier to fall into the idea that everything they get, I lose, and vice versa. So if we think about America's civic bargain and civic education, which is where I want to start, conclude here, the first thing that happens after the Constitutional Convention, of course, is the drive for ratification. And the Federalist Papers, famously, and then the op-eds, which were collected into, more recently, the Anti-Federalist Papers, all of these were basically op-eds, mostly in the New York papers, which were making arguments for and against the new Constitution. And fundamentally, what are they trying to do? They're trying to educate those citizens who will be voting for ratification in the arguments for or against the new system. So they're, fundamentally, we start out with not only educated people in Philadelphia making arguments to each other, but then bringing a set of arguments out to the rest of the population. So we begin in this whole enterprise of civic education. So there's a really interesting, complex story about bringing civic education through the 19th century, but you're not here to have a long history of American civic education. Jump forward to the 20th century and jump forward to a place I know something about, Stanford University. 1920, Stanford inaugurates a course in problems of citizenship. A year-long course taken by all first-year students. The director of citizenship called it a preparation for citizenship as a problem in education. Saw that fundamentally education ought to be, or ought to include, the question of citizenship. And the focus of the course is, once again, problems of liberty and cooperation. That's the original sketch of the syllabus for this course. So from the beginning in the 1920, what's happening in 1920? The 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. So suddenly you've doubled the number of citizens. This is after a period in which there had been very high levels of immigration into the country. And clearly Stanford and lots of other universities across the colleges and universities across the country saw part of their duty as educating citizens. That's what it looked like when they taught it. This is in 1924, but this is the original course. A big lecture hall filled with men and women. Stanford was, I'm happy to say, co-ed from the beginning. And they're being lectured to about problems of citizenship. Well, 1930s to the 1980s, and here I think Stanford is not terribly unusual in terms of other leading universities anyway. Problems of citizenship was replaced first with a course on Western civilization. That morphed into a course on Western culture, then into a course on culture, ideas, and values. And then in the 1980s, a series of objections to the whole enterprise. Western Civ has got to go, and there is then an interregnum period. There is simply nothing that is even pretending to be education of citizens at Stanford for some time. But more recently, this is a news story from 2021, we have piloted at Stanford a citizenship course for first-year students. It was partly pushed by my friend and colleague, Dan Edelstein. Dan really needs a shout out. He is one of the great university politicians. He got this through the Senate unanimously. I would not have been able to do this. I would have blown my stack at a couple of times and caused all kinds of upsets, but Dan's really good at it. But what I was doing in the meantime was this, creating well, I'm not going to do this quite right, but anyway, creating the Stanford Civics Initiative, which was behind the push to have to develop a curriculum and to persuade the administration that this was a good thing to do. So where are we now? Just this past winter, for the third time, we've been running it at full size, at least not quite full size, because we want it, in fact, to be all freshmen who are taking it. But currently, we're getting 2/3 of the freshman class, about 1,200 students, taking a course that is Citizenship in the 21st Century, shared syllabus, 80 sections taught by about 50 instructors, faculty, and postdocs, defined by freedom of speech, mutual respect, insistence on viewpoint diversity, and it is, once again, seminar style, so the idea is we work through these ideas and we try to exemplify what these practices are in the teaching of the course. There's only one plenary section a year when we get all of the students who are taking it together in a big auditorium. This is one from a couple of years ago. And I just point out that they're trying to once again exemplify what's going on. Condi Rice from the Hoover Institution, Pam Carlin, a sort of left of center professor in the law school, and then Jonathan Holloway sort of sitting in between as the middle guy. Anyway, showing that you can talk about the idea of citizenship, how to teach it, what it's about, from people who have very different points of view without yelling at each other, without treating each other as enemies. So this is, once again, the Civics Initiative, the webpage. Please go visit. You can see the courses that we're teaching, the goals that we have for the initiative. And more recently, just in January, we launched the Alliance for Civics in the Academy. This is a joint project between Stanford and the Hoover Institution. It's to create a network of those who are engaged in civic instruction from across the country. Indeed, we have people brought in from Canada. Now have about 150, well, something over 150 members, and we strongly welcome anyone who's interested. Drop me an email. We will add you to the membership of this. So just email me. And it's currently by nomination because the problem about setting up something like this is you'll get people who want to troll the whole thing. And we decided, we wanted to start it out relatively troll-free. So, if you're a horrible troll who wants to do this, please don't email me. Yeah, as if horrible trolls take that kind of advice. Anyway, but the goal is to create a community of practice, a space in which instructors in civics from red states, blue states, more conservative, more progressive programs, private and public institutions, well-resourced and ill-resourced institutions, colleges and so on, can come together in regular convenings, which we've been running, small group, to try to work out what is it that we can learn from each other, because there's a lot we can learn from each other, even though we don't agree on the curriculum, right? We'll have a different curriculum, but we can have, at a reasonably high level, shared commitment to principles, right? Free speech, viewpoint diversity, no ideological posturing in the classroom. And we can perhaps even agree on what it is this project of civic education is meant to achieve, some sort of a common good. So there's lots and lots of work on civic education happening. I usually want to finish saying, what can I do? Well, wherever you are situated, you can get involved in either your university, like here, or in one of a whole range of organizations that are pushing civic education. And some of them are more blue, and some of them are more red, but they're all sort of share this goal of we ought to be returning to the importance of educating citizens for the 21st century, or those who would hope to be citizens, right? Those who aspire to citizenship also need to be sharers. Well, that's it. Thanks very much from both Brook and myself, and really, really welcome questions.
My question is, to what extent do you think prioritizing a revival in religious participation and familial values is even a more foundational step than civic education? And what role has the decline in religious participation played in many of these problems that you've outlined for us? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think that what I would respond is that is going to be of great importance to many people. It's not of great importance to everybody, right? There are a lot of people in the United States who are fundamentally secular. They may have deep moral beliefs that are not religious beliefs. They may say, look, morality isn't for me, but I actually recognize that having a secure and reasonably prosperous community is important for me, so I'll buy into this civic bargain. I don't want a boss. So yes, I would encourage, growth in any, as it were, way of becoming more deeply committed to cooperative relationships that allow you to work with others, whether in your family, whether across your religious community, whether between religious communities, between religious and secular communities. But I think we can't, if we make the creating a common religion, or even creating a common commitment to religion, a prior to rebuilding civics, going to be pushing against really, I think, demographic facts that I wouldn't want to push for. So I would say, yes, go for that. But meanwhile, recognize that we may need to build out some civic commitments for people who are not either committed to family life nor to religious life, and yet could be seen as civic friends. Right? Once again, civic friends are not necessarily people you like. They're not necessarily people you want to hang out with, but they're people that you recognize are not your enemies. Right? That people with whom you are engaged in some common enterprise. Maybe a fairly thin one. I'd like to see it be a thicker one, a values-based one. But at least it is a common enterprise that pushes against this tendency to say us versus them, and it's zero sum, and devil take the hindmost.
Next question.
Yes.
Hello, thank you so much. This was wonderful. My name is Giselle. I'm in the Masters in Classics. And I'm curious, this concept of the bargain that usually traces itself along, as I can understand, status and wealth lines with the elite and the masses, how does that translate to a two-party system like our own, where the distinction between the elite and the masses certainly isn't quite so clear-cut? Right. And civic friendships sometimes seem impossible when the principle is we disagree on this, and this.
Yeah. So the bargaining between elites and masses is a step towards what we call the civic bargain. And the civic bargain is a bargain that we strike in a reasonably socially diverse populace, that we are going to be citizens, and we are not going to be run by a boss, and we're going to be run by ourselves. That may, that can entail exclusions, right? Think about the original American Revolutionary War. A lot of people were basically, or got the message, you're with this program of we're going to be a republic, or you're not, in which case you might want to head off to Canada. And they did. A lot of people went to Canada. So you can actually sort out, no, we want a boss. We like the king, okay? So this is not always a completely simple process. But by the time we get a civic bargain, it should not be seen in terms of elites and masses any longer. There may be still people who are elite, they have better education, they have more money and so on, so they may be imagined as elites, but we are citizens together. That's the whole point, I take it, of the civic bargain, is that we as citizens share things, and we have some kind of basic, we share freedoms, but we also share some kind of basic equality. We say that you ought to have equal influence with me, and that's why we say one individual, one vote, right? Your vote should be counted the same. So that's sort of the core notion. Where are we now? Well, I mean, I think it's worrisome. I mean, I started off by saying I'm worried about it because in some ways party systems can pull us apart, and people start lining up and saying, well, I'm on this side and I'm on that side, and those people on the other side are my enemies. We've seen this happening a lot. People saying that I couldn't tolerate the idea that my son or my daughter would marry somebody from the other political party. Apparently, that's now stronger than worry about marrying out of religion. So we're in a time in which this kind of friends enemies thing is. That's why I started out with Schmidt, saying this is a real worry. But what I would suggest is we need to push back against that and recognize that we in fact are sharers in a common enterprise. And even if you don't like the people on the other side, that's, once again, civic friendship isn't chums. Even if you don't like them, you recognize that you will need to work with them, and they get at least to have some payoff from the bargain, and that means you're not going to get everything that you want. So it's hard to take that on board in a time when people want to sweep the table. But if we don't take that on board, we're in, I think, a much more difficult situation for the survival of democracy.
My question had to do with duty and education and citizenship. So I'm in professors' Southern Constitutionalism class, so we've been talking about constitutive means a lot. Mm-hmm. So my question is, we have these great institutes here at Notre Dame, here at Stanford, where the elite is aware of their duties and of citizenship, mm-hmm. and like I said, the duties that go along with that. Is there a constitutive way to help ensure people who maybe don't have those opportunities and don't get to be a part of the elite education class are aware of their duties and know how to do it? I don't know if that's some education practice. I don't know. I know earlier you mentioned military service. I just would love to
know. Yeah, it's a really, really important point. And the answer is certainly yes. And this is why when we do things, at Stanford, or you do things at Notre Dame, I mean, these are elite universities, right? I mean, you're privileged to be part of it. I'm privileged to be part of it. But it can't just stay there. And that's why, at least at the level of higher education, the Alliance for Civics in the Academy is specifically meant to bring in people from public universities and from non-elite public universities, not just the Berkeleys and Michigans and so on, but state, North Carolina State and so on. We've not yet pushed down into two-year community colleges, but I recognize that is hugely important. And we've got to have what happens at universities be connected with programs for K-12 education. So, civics tends to get taught at many, not by any means all, primary and secondary schools in the country. But it's often not taught very well, and it's not taught in any sort of consistent kind of way. We've got to be working there, and we are indeed working at Stanford. Other places are working very hard. So many of these organizations here are working specifically on K-12. So the integrating higher ed with K-12, integrating what happens at elite universities and non-elite universities. And then we have to recognize that civic education should not be something that just happens when you're in school or in college. It's got to be something that we do throughout our lives, and in our lives that are in civil society. So in our religious communities, in our families, in our whatever other organizations one belongs to. I mean, this kind of duty to educate one another ought to be internalized. Now, we have a long way to go before most Americans think yes, what should I be doing? It's all about, educating one another about citizenship so that we can keep this thing democracy, so we don't have to have a boss telling us what to do, or an ultimate boss. But that's the goal. And that's what we really should be pushing for and working for. If we don't do that, if it just stays at the level of the elites, then we're going to get, we won't have achieved leadership, it's going to be great. Training elite leaders is very important. And so that's certainly part of it. But it can't be the whole of it. It's got to be a shared enterprise that goes across the whole social spectrum.
Thank you very much, Josh. I really liked your talk. I want to ask you a kind of, maybe it's a personal question. So I'm Italian. I moved to the US in 2017. I'm about to become a citizen. And coming from Italy, I was struck by the very deep sense of belonging to one of the two parties that I see in the US, because this is not what I perceive to be in Italy, for example. No? And the question I have is why is the sense of belonging to the party so strong in the US, to the point that really, because I noticed that makes it more difficult to talk if the persons belong to different parties, because it is as if you are attaching something maybe in the past was religion in Europe. I think in Europe is no longer religion, not even that, right? This, no? So, and also, is this sense of belonging been so strong since the beginning of the life of the US, or is it very recent?
Yeah, I think that, it's a very complicated question, and there's a whole literature on the history of parties and the place of parties. But one of the oddities about the American system is that the electoral college makes it very difficult for third parties to survive. You can have them pop up, but it's very difficult for a third party to ever imagine getting into power, because you have to get more than 50% of the electors who are from divided state by state. So the binary two-party system is distinctive, although it's not unique, right? In the UK, which doesn't have these kind of same rules, although there is a third party, the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the Labour Party has been pretty stable for a very long time. So there's a way in which certain democracies simply historically have fallen out into, your red or blue, or peaches or cream. Wrong metaphor. Anyway, so that's part of the answer. The strong identity, I think, is complicated. There certainly are a lot of people who are strongly identified, and they're very visible. They're the ones who show up at the big rallies and so on. And you see, oh my heavens, look, 10,000 people show up at a Trump rally, or at Bernie Sanders, an AOC rally. You think, wow, are people dedicated to their party? But in fact, an awful lot of people in the US are not. The number of people registering independent has actually grown over time, especially among younger cohorts tend to register independent more frequently. So we can sort of be, I think, misled by this. Now, the other big problem in the US, not to get too much into the weeds, but currently the primary system, which selects who is going to be ultimately running for office, tends to bring in the most passionate partisans of the two parties. Who shows up for a primary election of people who are really gung-ho about my party? The independents don't. In some states, you actually have to, you can only vote in a primary if you're registered for that party. So it selects out an awful lot of people for whom politics is not a blood sport. And so we tend to get pulled towards the extremes, and we tend to notice what's going on at the extremes. So, it's a long and complex story, but I think that recent history is not, once again, fully consistent with the longer history, and whether it's going to become more that people say, yeah, you're one or the other, you're the red team or the blue team, and get ready to fight the other miserable types that are the enemies, or whether it's going to be that people get tired of this stuff and say, no, actually, there's an awful lot of people who are somewhere in the middle, whether they're sort of on one left or somewhat right, but broad middle, and don't like this kind of extremity. I don't know. I mean, I know what I prefer, but at least I think the civic education story, if we say that bargaining really is at the core of it, you can't keep this thing going with zero-sum competitions and friends and enemies. At least that's one way to try to push towards what I see as the more desirable outcome rather than the less desirable.
Down here in front, more.
Thank you so much. I was actually going to ask about the primaries and other structural issues, but you just talked about that, so I won't. Instead, I'm going to ask about a different question, which is, as an academic, one of the things that worries me the most is it seems like academia is a public service, but we're public servants who in some ways have lost the public trust. And universities are extremely unpopular. I think this strategy is really, really helpful, but it's also, there's a longer term issue to face. And one of the big issues I find is it seems like educating undergrads is one thing, but there's also huge issues with people who've already graduated. And for example, I've heard stories about people in PhD, other graduate students who have had pretty rough times, or professors who face discrimination for a whole host of reasons. And so there's all these issues with how the universities are perceived. So I understand in one sense how this obviously helps correct the university's image, if this is a wider scale phenomenon, and it sounds phenomenal. But the other issue is how to keep it going so that way the issues that we're seeing in politics more generally are not replicated in the university system, because that is something that just straight up concerns me as someone who's involved in that part of it. So thank you so much.
It should be. I mean, I think that universities have tended to become, I'm now going to quote the former provost of Stanford, John Etchemendy, who certainly in his own politics is solidly left of center. In his going away address as provost to Stanford, what he said is that Stanford has a big problem, as do many American universities, and that it's become a monoculture, an ideological monoculture of the left. And this is speaking as a man of the left. So he was not saying, but he was not saying, this is hey, we win, cultural war, we swept the board. He was saying, this is a big problem. And this was about, I'm going to say 5 years ago now. No, longer than that, about 7 years ago now. So this is long before the current wave of, concern that has happened more recently. And a lot of people, myself included, thought, yeah, you're right, John. This really is a problem. And we ought to work to correct it. So that's part of what I try to do in the Stanford Civics Initiative. Is one of the things that we have successfully innovated is a kind of bridge so that senior fellows in the Hoover Institution who don't have a Stanford faculty appointment can teach undergraduate courses. So for example, if you go to our website, you'll see teaching right now this spring, maybe this very moment, I'm not sure what the day of the seminar is, Peter Berkowitz, who is a conservative, clearly conservative commentator, writes for the Washington Times, but is also a very serious political theorist, offers a course now, has done over the last 3 years in seminar style in varieties of conservative thought in America. Really a successful course. In fact, it tends to close out. I mean, he can only take so many students, and from talking with him, Peter and I have become friends over the last few years. What he says is he gets about maybe 1/3 conservative-leaning students in the class, and the rest of them are not. They range all over the spectrum, and yet they have these great classes. You know, they have good debates, they have good discussions, they haven't had any. There have been no issues. He was very nervous about it at the beginning. He said, "Okay, I'm going to do this, but I'm sure I'm going to get canceled." And I said, "Oh, I don't think so, Peter. You know, oh yeah, I'm going to be shouted down. There's going to be bullhorns. There's going to be." This was after his first class, first meeting of the first time he did this, and he came to me afterwards and he said, "Well, two things, Josh." He said, first, that was the most diverse group of students I've ever taught. He taught at Harvard back in the day, both ideologically and in any other way, optically that you could see. So that was striking to him. And second, he said, "No, I wasn't canceled. In fact, when they left the class at the end of the seminar, they thanked me." And it was like just a revelation to him. I mean, in this case, I think it was really the fear that the campus had become so hyper-polarized that there was no space for this. But we find there really is. So now we have a number of Hoover Fellows who are teaching, and it's really going well. We haven't had any issues, and it's still not creating parity of any sort, but we actually have people who are identified as conservatives, but who are, I think, very rightly dedicated to not teaching as ideological indoctrination. Peter teaches them about a very important intellectual tradition within American thought, without trying to persuade them that this is, the only valid tradition. So I think we need to have more of this, right? We need to have more ways to find ways to get real viewpoint diversity into our universities, and have it done so that it's not seen as, once again, it's not like, well, we're going to wedge in and, demand our rights to do. It ought to be seen by the university. This is really of value. So I don't know. We've been lucky at Stanford. It's worked out well. I think it does show it can be done, and it really should be done. I'm sure there are other colleges and universities that have a monoculture of the other side, and so they ought to be trying to bring in progressives too. But overall, I think this is at least where I live, and this is what I've been pushing for. And this is what the Alliance for Civics in the Academy is specifically meant to sort of say, well, can we learn from each other? Can a more liberal, progressive professor at Blue State learn from somebody who is at a red state university and is teaching a course that the Blue State guy never imagined. Say, well, gosh, I could take some of that stuff without having to do anything that would be morally incorrect. Anyway, so I think there's things we need to be doing, we should be doing, we can be doing. It's going to be different at each institution, but I think it's really doable, and at a time in which universities are looked at askance by much of the country, and looked at askance because, in a sense, we're seen as being, very one-sided. It's incumbent upon us not only to do that because our students deserve it, but it's incumbent upon us to do that because it would be nice that this institution survived my lifetime.
Last question. John Luke.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is about how you would respond to a certain critique, which is that certain issues, whether you're on the left or the right or whichever side, are so fundamental that they can't be bargained over. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you spoke a lot about the civic bargain of the American Constitution, And the abolitionist critique was that, the Constitution is kind of a compromise with the devil in the sense of like admitting slavery and not resolving that problem, and which eventually led to the Civil War and like a kind of conflict of real friends and enemies. And perhaps some of the issues that are debated today are wrongly elevated to that status, but it seems like some do deserve that kind of status, such as abortion or other kind of fundamental moral questions. So how do you think this approach of the civic bargain should deal with those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a very hard question. The bargain struck in 1787 was to keep the nation as one. But there was no reason to believe it necessarily would have to be. There was a proposal that actually never made it to the floor, but it was developed by one of the Southern delegates to divide the country into 4 different countries. And obviously, you would have at least 2 of them. Slavery would be formally institutionalized, that would be, and then the others it could be not. If that had happened, I think most of the delegates recognized the disunited states would have been quickly taken over by European powers. War of 1812 was serious enough thing in itself. So it was a security. In order to have security, in order to have baseline welfare, you're going to have to keep one country. And that was the cost of doing business, was a bargain on this deeply important moral question. Now, both sides, I think, thought that in the long run, there would be more discussions, more bargains would be cut, and it would go their way. Certainly the abolitionists had reason to believe that with the end of the Atlantic slave trade, which was built into the Constitution, that slavery would just wither away, and within a generation or 2, it wouldn't be around anymore. Well, that didn't turn out, right? And so it's an important point to say that bargaining can turn out to end up in a bad position, because you look at what happens between 1787 and 1860, and it's kicking the can of what to do about slavery down the road. And it's some very clever bargains that maintain parity between the slave states and the non-slave states, very carefully negotiated, but which ultimately mean that at some point it's going to blow. So I think that there's bargains and bargains, right? There ought to be the possibility of bargains that move towards justice. Now, when you have fundamental difference of opinion about what justice is, then you're going to have real difficulty. But at least as long as you're bargaining, and if you think your side has the better argument, the more convincing argument, then you ought to be, once again, you're going to be impatient, you're going to say it should happen right now, but you ought to be willing to say, well, we will, in the end, win this because we have the better arguments. And that my fellow citizens should, in the end, come to see that this is a compelling argument. How soon that happens? Does it happen? But if you really have the courage of your convictions, if you really believe that better arguments ultimately can win out, or at least can gain the kind of majorities that take to put them into legislation, then you ought to stay at the bargaining table. It's the temptation is always to say, no, that's not good enough. And what I ultimately have to say is there is a solution, and that is give up on the democracy thing. Say what we need is a boss who will put in place my conception of justice, and who will simply command this to be the case. But that comes at real costs, right? And anybody who's done the history of the 20th century has some conception of what happens when you turn over power to those who say, you know, the vanguard will bring final justice. Whether it's on the left with Lenin or on the right with the fascists. So I would just ask yourself if you say, no, this is of such importance that I cannot accept the democratic process will someday or eventually give me a better position or maybe the right position. If you say that ultimately we just need to have the boss decide, then ask yourself, what's going to be the aftermath, right? You read 10 Days That Shook the World about the original Russian Revolution. It's thrilling. You think, this is going to be so great. Oh man, all power to the Soviets, yes! And then you read what happens a few years later with Lenin, and then you read what happens with Stalin, and you think, wow, did something that at least started out sounding like, you know, a movement toward justice, just turn over power to the leader, ends up in something very grim. So anyway, that would be my warning. That democracy is imperfect. It is maddeningly so, but bosses are too, and perhaps in ways even more dangerous. So thanks very much.